This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Although it is not Labor Day, summer is officially over for us.
That's the truth.
As we are back in the office, as we may have mentioned before, but now with students. We have athletes reporting for their pre-season workouts, and so they're wandering around, and we're registering students, and It's a fun time.
Well, meteorologically, summer doesn't end until well into September.
Okay,
so.
I don't.
Meteorologically.
Okay.
That was one of the most snarkiest things you've ever said on this podcast.
Well, maybe I'm just feeling it.
Apparently you are. Is your day off to a rough start?
Summer's over.
Yeah. Are you even listening?
I don't know. There's got to be something more going on there. Like,
Well, there
was
probably
there a big
is.
fight in the house before
No.
you walked out? You know?
No. It was my daughter's 17th birthday. We had a lovely day yesterday.
Oh, nice. Good for her. That's exciting.
Sad. I mean, that she's 17, like where the year's gone, but here we are.
That's true. I know what that feels like.
But with the new semester starting up, we've got new classes on the horizon, and we thought we'd share what we're most looking forward to teaching this semester.
Right. Yeah.
You want to start?
Oh, okay. You're both looking at me, so I'm happy to start. I think I'm excited about all my classes.
Of course
Just sort of say, well, I don't really want to teach this class this semester, but so I'm excited about all of them. But I'm teaching a new class that I haven't taught in quite a few years on the Book of Acts as a standalone Bible elective, and I'm looking forward to that. I always tell students I have taught the Book of Acts more than any other book of the Bible, and I just feel like I know it intimately. So it's kind of nice to resurrect it. And just be able to do a really, really deep dive into it. So, yeah, I'd say I'm excited about that. And then my other ones are just, revising what I've always been doing. How about you guys?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the Jesus of Nazareth course, which is a brand new course for the college.
Yep.
We've been teaching the Gospels, for decades, and not really and before that we taught a class called Life of Christ.
Right.
But again, that was very gospel driven. Like, what does Matthew say about Christ? What does Mark say? Luke? What is the differences? And how does John come in from a totally different perspective? It's Jesus through the eyes of the gospel writers. And this class, and we still teach that, right? I mean, you teach that in NT1.
Yep.
But this is kind of a theology of Jesus course.
Yeah.
And so, you might call it Christology. That's what a lot of schools teach it. But I'm coming at it from some different angles. We're focusing on Jesus as Messiah. What does it mean for him to be Messiah?
Yeah.
The fulfillment of Israel's story and the culmination of human history, according to the Old Testament story. What does it mean for Jesus to be our teacher?
Yeah.
Right? What does it mean to Jesus to be our Lord and Lord of the cosmos? What does it mean for Jesus to be fully human, fully divine, and getting into some of the debates of church history? What does it mean for him to be the head of the church?
Yeah.
Right. So a theology of Jesus, and the sources for Jesus studies are very different than other sources there's a lot of popular level books written on this it's a sophomore level class. So students are just getting into the NT1 course, right? So they don't know necessarily a lot about Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, we can't assume they understand what it means to call him Messiah, for instance, which is so basic to many of our listeners. Some of our students just think Christ is his last name. Right? And so just realizing that students, their eyes are going to be opened up to that for the first time. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to it. And the books are great. Sky Jatani has a book, What If Jesus Was Serious? Which is kind of going through the Sermon on the Mount with pictures.
Oh, wow.
Like, he has this picture and 2.5 pages of explaining, and the pictures are snarky. Like what Jesus said about topic X, what Americans today think about it, right?
Yeah.
Or American Christians. And you see in the picture the contrast.
Yeah.
And then he wrestles with that in light of a certain section of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, which is a fascinating textbook that I can't wait for students to get into. And then there's a great new book on atonement theories, kind of recast in modern day kind of imagery. And so there's just so much interesting material on Jesus. Students are going to be studying how different movies portray Jesus, how painting icons portray Jesus, how certain hymns and songs portray Jesus. And they're just going to be wrestling with the portrait of Jesus for instance, in The Simpsons, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
And other things. So really looking forward to it. It's been a lot of my creative energy has gone toward coming up with the frame for that new class. So I just can't wait to execute it.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, and I like that it's going to be running parallel to New Testament 1 because, NT1 is over half of it is just going through the Gospels individually and looking at them from a textual point of view.
Yep.
And so they're going to get the textual point of view on the Gospels, and they're going to get a theological point of view on the Gospels. And we're just going to hit them hard with Jesus, in this fall semester. So it's an exciting combination of courses.
Yeah, and it's very intentional that it's their sophomore year, first semester. Like, they've gotten the freshman crazies out of the way, right? And like they're serious. And some of them are just here for 2 years to get the associate's degree. So we're going to hit them hard with Jesus before they leave.
Right.
Yep.
And for others, it will be the foundation, establishing their hopefully Christocentric worldview as they go forward for all 4 years.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, it is an important semester. So.
Agreed.
Yeah.
For me, I actually have a class for every year of study. So I have a freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior level class, which is kind of interesting how that worked out. And while I am teaching advanced Hebrew, which I love because I just show up and they translate and I tell them, yes or no. My favorite class probably to teach is worship in the Old Testament. And it's just a class where we walk through just what worship was and the feasts and festivals. And we celebrate many of them. So there's a lot of food and frivolity. So it ends up being a good time. That's a junior level, so they're a little more serious, right? They're taking this as a Bible elective, and so it usually ends up being a really good class.
I love having people go back and read about like the feasts and festivals because I like to tell people God told the Jews to have a party, told Israel
regularly
to party.
Yeah.
People have this idea of God as like this really serious, stoic, ready to smack people down and all that. I'm like, God kept telling the Israelites, throw a party and have fun. And what does that say about God?
Right.
Throw a party and have fun.
So it's a fun class, typically. So, yeah.
Yeah, any of these courses sound interesting to you? It's not too late to register for classes.
Yeah.
We could use a few more. We have a target number of students who want to reach this semester, and we're closing in on it. It seems very much within reach, but you could help put us over. So
or your child, or your nephew or niece,
or your grandchild,
yes.
Or your next door neighbor who's trying to figure out what to do with his or her life. Yeah.
or your papa.
Yeah.
Sure. All the things.
Whoever's listening. Someone related to you needs to come to Great Lakes this semester. You know who they are.
If it's not you, send somebody our way.
Yeah.
All right.
That's great.
Well, we're continuing our series through peace and violence in the Bible. And last week we spent a great deal of time on the Psalms, and especially dealing with the imprecatory Psalms that seem to be very driven by vengeance.
Yeah.
And this week we think we're going to wrap up the Old Testament. We have the wisdom literature to look at. So several Proverbs are going to be surveying. The book of Ecclesiastes has a thing about peace and war. And then we're going to end with the book that, to me really stands out among the Old Testament witness for being the closest thing to an Old Testament book that really seems to promote or at least justify God's people taking vengeance in their own hands. And so we're going to end with that book. We'll let you, a little teaser. You can try to guess what that is, and we'll hit you with it at the end. I think I mentioned it last episode, but...
So if anybody was paying attention last time, then they're like, oh, I know.
They may know
exactly
the answer.
Right.
So.
All right. So, we begin in Proverbs, and in Proverbs 3. And just as a reminder for those who don't know, or I guess it's not a reminder if you don't know, it's a reminder for those who do know and for those who don't, there's a lot of personification here where wisdom and folly are basically viewed as two different women.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to read here is going to say things like she, it's referring to wisdom. And so it begins in chapter 3, verse 13. Happy are those who find wisdom and those who get understanding, for her income is better than silver, and her revenue better than gold. She's more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. And it's that last part that we want to focus in on. We're going to read through these and kind of make some observations, but that last one is her ways, all her paths are peace, as opposed to violence.
Yeah. I like that last point. That's a good one. The next one we're going to look at is Proverbs 4, verses 14 through 17. It says, do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evildoers. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. Kind of the exact opposite of those wise people you just read about, Sam.
Yep. All right, so folly and wickedness partake in violence, whereas wisdom partakes in peace.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
All right. Proverbs 12:20. Deceit is in the mind of those who plan evil, but those who counsel peace have joy. And this is interesting, kind of those who counsel peace, like, kind of encouraging us to be people, not just people of peace, but people who, counsel others to pursue the path of peace.
Yeah.
Or, a positive influencer for peace.
Kind of makes me think of blessed are the peacemakers.
Yep.
Wasn't quite a new idea for Jesus.
Right. And the last one in Proverbs, sorry. Is Proverbs 16:7. It says, when the ways of people please the Lord, he causes even their enemies to be at peace with them. And this one talks about when you actually live out what God expects you to do, the result is peace between people.
Yeah.
Which is not exactly what Jesus says, but that's fine. We're not with Jesus at the moment.
Well,
We're not looking at
Someone
Jesus
else needs to
at the
take the Jesus course.
I get it. I know.
moment. Oh, boy. He's with us. We're not with him. I don't know. That's the thing. If there's a distinction we can make there.
Abiding in him with John.
There's this new class we're going to be doing called Jesus of Nazareth. I think
That's
you might want
fine.
to check that out.
All right, I'm done.
Clunk, he walks out the door.
So,
you guys.
so as we, when we think about these different proverbs, and they all are just extolling the value of peace that are linked with wisdom, as though someone who finds wisdom will also find peace. And we were just talking before the episode started, but for me, I find that fascinating in a culture that is very warlike.
Yeah.
Right. This is where there's not a lot of peace to be found.
Yeah.
Your tribes are warring, nations are warring, super empires are coming in. Like there seems to be constantly the threat of some sort of violence or war. These people who spend their whole lives finding what wisdom is, what the best life to live is, think peace is it. Right?
Yeah.
Who think that it's that living this particular kind of life that is wisdom or that is framed by, it doesn't mention Torah, but following the way of Yahweh, the way of the Lord, will lead to peace. And for me, that's fascinating in a culture where that just was not likely.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. When historically would you place the Proverbs, like in Israel's history?
I would say they were probably formulated during the monarchy, the divided monarchy. I mean, some with Solomon, but probably even after him. Yeah. And so, if you know the history, there wasn't a lot of peace, right? North and South fighting, Syria fighting, Assyria, Egypt. I mean, it's just like there's always someone who really was attacking them.
Yeah, so after they chose kingship like the nations, rejected the Lord as their king, and now they're doing this experiment that God says this is a bad idea, right? Getting into being like the nations, having an army like the nations. So, I think it's important to notice, like they've, we talked about Torah, and it says you're not to become like other nations, you're to rely upon God, and instead they're like, no, we don't feel safe that way. We'd rather have the army and the king and the military commander, and God's like, I'll let you do this, but it's going to go bad.
Yeah.
And it's going to hurt you, and it's going to fall apart, and then I'm going to have to pick up the mess. So we're in mid-experiment.
Right.
And then so you have these certain psalmists, certain prophets, and certain sages who are trying to cast a better vision.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to hold the line of the ways of Yahweh and the ways of peace, and like you said, in a time that's been filled with war.
Yep.
Yeah, you mentioned in a previous episode the idea that some of these psalms that are either attributed to David or the time of David or whatever. David, who was a very warlike man, who had blood all over his hands, so to speak. You have psalmists who are extolling peace and calling for a different vision, and it's the same thing. With the monarchy. It's not just kings, but having a standing army and drafting the strongest, most able-bodied men to serve in the army. And among those people are those who are going, but wise people want peace. Wise people find peace. Wise people pursue peace. Wise people even have peace with their enemies. And so it is really striking that in the midst of that, there are still Israelites who are going, I think there's a better way. not really falling into the trap of the monarchy and all that goes with it.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, without war, they don't think they're going to find peace. Without conquering nations around them, like putting that buffer between themselves, they don't see peace as a possibility.
Yeah.
And so for someone to come along and say, you should counsel peace, that's the best way.
Yeah.
They're like, no, that's not going to work.
Well, I'm sure the path to peace for them was very similar to nowadays. The way you have peace with your neighbors is have a stronger army so they know that they cannot attack you and have success. And so having a strong army is a great deterrent, and that's how you have peace. I'm sure they were thinking in very similar ways, or maybe even better, we'll go and attack them and take their land and all that.
Yeah, it's worth noting, I think, back in seminary, we talked about, by studying the Proverbs, who we think the target audience might be, right? Like, who is it that would be most like to be receiving these Proverbs as instruction? And at least in my training, the answer came, like, these were upwardly mobile male Jews who had nobility within reach.
Right.
These are people who might become kings or commanders or people of influence in Israel. Like, it's very androcentric, right? There's not a lot of, Proverbs giving women wisdom on how to be a good wife. It's kind of like, man, this is what a good wife looks like, that you should be looking for, right?
Right.
And so, when these Proverbs are about pursuing peace, this is instruction for people who might have political power soon.
Right.
Like, you are going to have to be in power as those who are promoting peace and looking for peace. And to me, the one that stuck out the most is the Proverbs 16 passage. The ways of the people please the Lord. He causes even their enemies to be at peace with them. Like, when they live in ways that please God, they don't have enemies to fight against. Mm-hmm. Like, if they were, and to me, I interpret it as embrace the way of Torah, embrace the God's unique posture for his people in the world, and you won't have to worry about your standing army, and you won't have to worry about military commanders, and you won't have to worry about alliances if you're pursuing the ways of the Lord that please him.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the best defense, or best offense is a good defense, or best, the best way to go forward in peace for your whole people is for you to, stick fast to the laws of the Lord.
Yeah.
And presumably he will fight your armies and your enemies, and he will keep them at bay so they're not a problem that you have to strategize against.
Well, that's what I was just thinking, that when you commit yourself to that, it's a radical step of trust in God. Say, okay, God, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to take these things into my own hands because I'm trusting you to take care of it for me. And that is a radical step of faith. And I know people who struggle with it. They're like, I'm not sure if I can really trust. I feel like I've got to have this fallback plan where I can take it into my own hands. And whenever you do that, the fallback plan becomes the plan. It's not a fallback plan. It's like you either trust God or you don't, and there is no plan B.
Yeah, I would say from a more practical or Machiavellian perspective, becomes a people that are so well liked that no one wants to attack you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, that's and well liked is not a good way of framing what Torah does, but becoming people that are so attractive, like, man, they're pretty awesome. I don't think we should go, attack them and take their stuff. Right. And I think that's part of it. And yes, God's going to protect them, but that's not exactly how it's framed in the Proverbs. Just like you become such a compelling people that they wouldn't want to mess with you. They want to have you call you friend, and that leads to peace.
It makes me think of passages that extol them towards things like generosity, being open-handed towards your neighbor and all that. And that's directed towards Israel, specific towards Israel. But if you're living in a country where God has blessed you with a kind of abundance, rather than closing your borders and hoarding it all to yourself, looking across the border to places like, Edom or someplace like that. And it's like, those guys are struggling over there. You know what? Let's help them out. They are our, technically our relatives in a very distant sense, and to say, guys, we'll help you out with this. And so what you were saying, Sam, when you practice that level of generosity and kindness to those around you, loving your neighbors and all that, who's going to want to attack you? It's like, no, these guys are taking care of us. We want to maintain this good relationship that's not only benefiting them, but benefiting us.
Yeah, it reminds me of the other Proverbs that talk about big walls. In the minds of wealthy people, the big walls are their security. Mm-hmm. And there's some that kind of say, walls around one's property is one's safety. And then another one's like, yeah, people with lots of wealth think they're safe because of their walls, but they're not.
Yeah.
And so, if they're pursuing wealth, if they're pursuing gold, wealth, and riches, then they're paranoid about having to lose their wealth. And so they're building walls to try to protect their wealth. And then those walls create certain kind of relationship with your neighbors, right? Of walls of separation. And then those things make you feel safe, but you're not truly safe.
Yeah.
But to pursue, a Torah vision of economics, of generosity, of not hoarding wealth that you have to protect by building walls around it. Like, if you live the way of life commended in Torah, and for the Proverbs, the way commended by wisdom of being generous and helping the poor out and things like that, you won't need to be paranoid so that you have to worry about walls. Yeah. And then those walls don't become a false security. Yeah. And you can live at peace.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's just a sampling of Proverbs.
Sure.
On the issue of peace and violence. There's not a whole lot of, those who are wise will be tactical in how they employ violence or strategic, and it's a different kind of vision here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain. I can't think of a proverb that says anything like that. It'll say things like, make sure the king respects you and you have his ear, but it doesn't say things like so that you can then use that for. I mean, it just doesn't go that step further. In fact, most of the times, violence is equated with foolishness, or that you've gotten yourself into a situation through anger, and the violence is often associated with another vice that is not good for a wise person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wisdom in the Proverbs does not make sure you keep a gun under your pillow.
No. Right. Yeah.
It's just, and for this to be a time of war, a time of kingship and rulership like the nations. Even the wisdom literature that's trying to be as practical as possible. It's not like spiritual kind of wisdom, right? This is day in and day out, everyday life situations. Retribution and stuff is just not a popular theme.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Hey, my name's Greg Stauffer. You might remember me from the After Class podcast, A Night for a King movie review. I'm also the guy who made the After Class bingo game. I'm here to give you an important announcement. Great Lakes Christian College has decided to start a new Equipping Kingdom Workers Now initiative. We're asking any student that was in a high school week of camp or CIY move that made a decision to pursue a career in a kingdom field to contact us because we would like to offer them our Intro to Biblical Interpretation class online for $300. That's $150 off the regular dual enrollment price. Introduction to Biblical Interpretation is a class that helps us to grasp how we got the Bible, the traditional interpretations that we hold. We'll explore various genres and gain an understanding of what inspiration means. It's essentially a Bible overview that we would like to offer to high school students that want to pursue a career in a ministry field for a reduced price. If you're interested in this, please contact Great Lakes Christian College at this email address, admissions@glcc.edu by August 31st in order to register. The class begins on October 17th, and we would love to be able to start equipping kingdom workers now for this initiative. Thank you.
We've got one other passage from the wisdom literature from Ecclesiastes 3. Some people recognize this, the song by the Byrds back in the day when they turn. Exactly, for everything, turn. Right, got to get that third turn in there. Yep. So, beginning Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1: For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. That's like the chorus of that song. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh. I'm going to jump to the end.
Thank you.
A time to love, time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. And so here the author of Ecclesiastes seems to be saying, well, there's a time to go to war, and there is a time for peace. Just like everything else, sometimes you got to go to war, sometimes you got to go to peace. Is that what he's saying? Is that what he's encouraging us to do? Or is that how he's encouraging us to think? What is he really trying to communicate to us there? Look at you Old Testament guys here.
I would suggest not, actually.
Yeah.
I know it's hard to view this without that song in your mind, which is such kind of I would say happy song,
Yeah.
but just kind of like, yeah, you look around and that's just what life's like. Like, okay. And so whatever time I need to find myself in, that's okay.
Well, you think about it. It is a funny thing for them to sing back in the 60s when protests against the Vietnam War were so strong. And it was like, well, sometimes there's a time for war. It's almost like anti-thematic for the people of that time period.
But I would suggest that based on the rest of the book and his attitude about life, is the fact that there is a time for everything is not something to be lauded. It is something that makes him sad, and he's over it all. And so, for example, if it keeps going, see, the problem is it keeps going. He says in verse 11. We'll do 11. He's made everything suitable for its time. He's put a sense of the past and the future in their minds. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. Like, you can observe that there's all sorts of things going on. That doesn't mean you just sort of live into that time. Instead, he says, there's nothing better to do than just to be happy and find happiness somewhere. And so it's not. So this passage shouldn't be used to condone. Oh yeah, well, certain times you have to go to war because it says it right there. Like, no, he's observing this was what happens, and for him, it's more of a source of frustration than anything. Not a condoning the fact that, well, at various points, you're going to have to go to war. That's just life.
Yeah, it seems that Ecclesiastes, in many ways, it provides a necessary counterpoint to the book of Proverbs. Because there's a kind of, at best, I think Ecclesiastes is kind of melancholy about the way the wisdom literature really works. At worst, it's pessimistic. But it's like you have all these really kind of positive things in Proverbs, and then you get to Ecclesiastes but does it really work that way? It seems like he's asking that question. And so Ecclesiastes, like I said, it just seems to be a counterpoint to, and I think that's why it comes right after Proverbs. You got all these great Proverbs, but before we stop, let's read Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, it challenges simplistic wisdom. Like Proverbs say, hey, the person who sows for peace will reap peace. And then you look at your life and say, I've been sowing for peace for decades, and all I've reaped is war. Like you're frustrated with it. Like the wisdom doesn't deliver. And here's Koheleth, the voice of Ecclesiastes, is just exasperated with, he's not getting out of life what he's putting in. And he seems to be following all the right rules and all the right principles, and nothing good is happening. And what do you do when you feel that way, right? And he's just laying out all the injustices that he has. And yeah, to me, this list seems more descriptive than prescriptive.
Right.
Like in life, there's going to be times of laughter and times of mourning. Does that mean, you'll mourn because your daughter got crushed by structure of the house fell down? Like, well, there's a time for that. So there's nothing wrong with daughters being crushed and bad craftsmanship and constructing buildings. Like, no, it happens. You got to create space in your life for those times. Mm-hmm. It doesn't condone the things that make you mourn,
right?
Or a time to live, a time to die.
Yeah,
death's okay because Ecclesiastes says there's a time to die. Like, we don't have to feel like death is an evil. It must be God's will that people die. Actually, no, it's a product of sin, and God through Jesus is overcoming death and giving life. So when you go through the list, it's not a list of, there's a time when you should be about this, and then you should be about that.
Right,
right.
There are just times in life where you're going to experience all of those things. It's just a part of the rhythms that humans experience in a fallen world. And to continue this guy's thought, and I think this is exactly what you were saying, Sam, and it sucks and it's not fair.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not fair that it's like that. But nonetheless, you're going to experience life like that.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And just because there's a time to love and a time to hate, doesn't mean justifies hatred.
Right.
Yeah.
It's in a fallen world with fallen brains and fallen societies around, feelings of hatred are going to well up in us. Jesus is going to have some things to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think, but you can say though, I think if you want to kind of read this not in Koheleth's world, where just descriptive everything that's not fair about the world, and read it in terms of Torah, the time for war is when God says, I have declared war, I have given the enemy into your hands, go fight and depend upon me and not your sword.
Right. Yeah.
That's the time for war. If you're a Jew, if you're a Jew and you're going to apply this, the time for war is not, if they're living in exile, when, like say they're living in Persia, when the Persians are going to war with their enemy, time for Jews to go to war. So the Persians, they would never read it that way, to join in the war of the nations, right? For them, the only time for war is when God declares war and enlists his people who don't have a trained army and don't have advanced weaponry. And God says, go grab your torches and horns and we're going to go take down the city.
Right, yeah.
That's the time if you're a Jew.
Yeah.
So I think it's tempting to use this time and divorce it from the Jewish context and try to insert it into the wars between nations today. And that would be the ultimate misuse of the passage, I would think.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So that's wisdom literature.
Yep.
So I guess we've got the surprise one now, right? Is that where we're pivoting to at this point? The surprise book?
Yeah. And this the book is Esther, if you didn't guess already.
Not Song of Songs? Disappointing.
We've spent a lot of time on the book of Esther, and for those of you because we did a movie review of One Night with the King, right?
Yes.
Yep. And we went quite in depth about this book, and a lot of our answer to the puzzle posed by Esther is a contextual reading of the whole book, like usual. But the crux of the matter comes into place in Esther 8:13. I think it's my turn to read, right?
Sure.
And this is after, if you know the book of Esther, you know that Haman got really ticked at Mordecai for not extolling him as, the greatest guy in Persia. And so he wanted to avenge himself upon Mordecai by setting a day when the king would exterminate all Jews throughout the empire, which would be basically genocide.
Right.
The people of God all throughout the Persian Empire, which was the known world at the time that the Jews were a part of. They would go out of existence if this edict was carried out literally to the letter.
I mean, all the way to the land of Israel, the promised land. That's part of the Persian Empire. So guess what? All you Jews in Israel, you're going to die too.
Yeah. And in Egypt. I mean, they went that far. So, and the story goes that God, through Esther, this uncommon marriage to a pagan king, is able to raise awareness of Haman's evil plot, and the plot is foiled. And so the king's like, Esther, what do you want to do? How should we go forward? And she's like, well, there are a bunch of people on a certain day on the calendar who are prepared to go kill all my relatives. We have to be able to defend. It almost seems like it's too late. And the Persians really can't. They have this thing where they don't change edicts. Right. They have this. You're going to say something?
Yeah, that's a bit. It's in the Bible. I don't think we've found that to be actually true in history, but nonetheless, it's part of the vehicle of the storytelling.
Okay. Yeah. So from the Jews' perspective, what Persia boasts is that once a king sets a decree, you can count on it, and it's not revocable. Yeah. And so, so this presents a problem. The king has already set out a decree that the Jews must be exterminated on this day, and so that's going forward, and you just can't put it on the news, decree over, and it won't happen. It's going to happen. So the question is what to do about it and how to go forward. And so Mordecai and Esther kind of give counsel to the king of, allow the Jews to defend themselves. Allow them to fight back against those who are going to kill them. So chapter 8, verse 13 kind of uses the most stark language. So a decree was written that kind of gives the Jews this permission. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So a certain day, when everyone was about to exterminate the Jews, a decree was sent out. And on that day, when people were trying to kill the Jews, there's a writ saying, and the Jews are allowed to avenge themselves on those who try to exterminate them.
Exactly.
But what stands out here is just the language of revenge. if you do a study of revenge, and we alluded to this last week, how does the Old Testament talk about vengeance? When it comes to vengeance of the nations doing things to God's people, it's vengeance is mine.
Yeah.
Rely upon God to do it. Do not take vengeance into your own hands. And even the psalmists, they pray these imprecatory psalms like, may bad things happen to my enemies, the bad things they did to us. It's a prayer to God to do it, because the Jews have this understanding that it's not God's will that they be the ones to do it, except in Esther. They can exact revenge on their enemies. And there's nowhere in the book of Esther where God speaks to Mordecai and Esther and says, I want you to have the king put this decree, and on that day I will do the fighting for you. Right. There's, like you saw in Judges, like you saw throughout the kingship, like you saw during the Exodus and the conquest, God doing the fighting. There's no whiff of God being the warrior on behalf of his people, and they're just kind of cleaning up the mess.
Yeah.
Right. And so this seems to be the exception, really, in the Old Testament that says God's people, without God's help, go get revenge.
The one thing that's really notable about Esther, and people point this out all the time, is God's total absence in the book of Esther. Just never mentioned. The name God, the name Yahweh never, ever comes up in the book of Esther. And so I think that's going to be a factor that comes into it. God seems to be absent in this decision. And what does that say about the idea of the Jews sort of taking vengeance? Was God for it? Was he against it? Was he just sitting back and going, all right, you can make your own decision, do what you got to do, what you think you have to do, but don't try to drag me into it. And this is where, again, I'm not the Old Testament guy, I'm the New Testament guy. But it seems like even Esther kind of has a little bit of a weird place in the canon, that Esther is somewhat debated. And some people say, well, yeah, God's never mentioned, and so that gives it a weird place in the canon. I also wonder if it's passages like this that give it a weird place in the canon, because they're like, yeah, the Jews are out there taking vengeance and killing off their enemies. God's never mentioned. This seems to be a little bit outside of how we think about how our scriptures work. And so I don't know if that's true or not, because this is not my area of specialty, but it is an interesting thought to keep in mind.
Yeah, it definitely plays into it. I mean, and that's why there are the additions to Esther that kind of help smooth out some of those difficulties, like mentioning God, and there's a prayer, and there's things going on where, on its own, the version we have, it's absent, and it's uncomfortable, and it probably should be, because it makes us think what's going on here. At the same time, you have a lot of history that we talked about in our episode about Esther, about the Agagites and Saul, and how this is all playing in. And you also have the idea of God protecting his people even in exile. And what does that look like? And yet none of that's actually mentioned in the book. And so we're bringing a lot of previous history and previous understanding into the book and applying it. And the question is, did they do that, or is this something else? Is this just Jewish propaganda, which some people accuse it of?
It's interesting. I mean, Esther is not really a part of salvation history. It's not a part of, the way the Jews divide up the canon. You have the law, right, the prophets and the writings. And the law is basically the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books associated with Moses. But then you have the prophets, which are, we think of prophets as Isaiah through Malachi, right? But for the Jewish people and in the Jewish Bible, the prophets were salvation history, the history through a prophetic perspective. So Joshua, Judges, skip over Ruth, Samuel, Kings, right? They are part of this prophetic history lumped together with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the rest, right? And this is kind of like the salvation history narrative. And in English Bibles, Esther's thrown right in there.
Right.
Yeah. All the history books, and Esther's right in there with them.
Just chronological, right? It's Ezra, Nehemiah, same sort of approximate period.
Yeah. But for the Jewish scriptures, Esther is in this section called the writings.
Yeah.
Just additional writings. And as you mentioned, Ron, that cluster of writings for a long time was a loose collection. Which ones are in, which ones are out. And Esther was the book most on the fringe.
Yeah.
voted least likely to make it into the canon.
Least likely to succeeded.
But then made it into the canon anyway, right? Like the last one in.
She was always standing at the
last
wall
one
at
to
the
make the
prom,
cut.
waiting for somebody to come
Just like
and ask for dance.
the March Madness, just like the Team 64, just the last one in.
And I think it's because this book isn't really given salvation history.
Right.
This is not the mighty acts of God in world history. This is really, if you read Esther on its own terms, it is a short story rooted in the lived experience of Jews in exile, of how in their time of exile, they had to kind of figure out and negotiate their existence among a hostile group of nations around them.
Yeah.
And they're having to use wisdom and discretion. And something happened at one point where the lives of a massive amount of Jews were on the line. And through the heroic acts of Mordecai and Esther, like, God's people were spared. And that becomes the basis of a festival that the Jews celebrate, the Feast of Purim. And this story, in many ways, is preserved to be the script behind the festival.
Yeah.
Right? It's a festival tract.
Yeah.
Right? And so it served a function, every year around the time of the Feast of Purim, at the time when the edict went out to destroy the Jews would celebrate how they survived, and they would retell the story. And so it's not salvation history, right? But it is included because I think it does give testimony of how, and I think most people would say it's by divine providence that this all came about, that Haman got exposed, that Esther was, even though no Jewish woman should marry a pagan king,
Right.
That through these strange events, right? And, there's fasting in the book, and petition, presumably everyone's fasting so that God would be with Esther. Like, he's kind of the implied, person in the background pulling the strings. I know, to me, that does something to it. Locating it in this group of writings that's really behind, a Jewish record of why they celebrate this great feast, and a very entertaining story that they retell and reread and publicly reenact whenever the festival comes along, rather than this is a part of the Jewish storyline of salvation history of God's mighty acts. Its function for the Jews is different than a normative text for what to do in situations like this. It's not a how-to-do text. Again, it's the difference between descriptive and prescriptive.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, and you talk about it being this exilic text of people living really far away, far, far from the promised land. And I think that in some ways it's probably reflective of the way at least some Jews felt. Where is God? He seems so far away. We're still trying to maintain our identity and maintain some semblance of faithfulness to God, but we feel like we're kind of doing it on our own. Because God isn't mentioned, we feel like we're trying to use what God has revealed in a way to inform what we do. And I think you're right. I think that any reader senses that God is involved. I think that's how exilic Jews felt a lot of the time. God hasn't abandoned us, but he sure does seem far away, to the point where we don't even mention him in this book because we think we're doing the right thing, but we don't really have a prophetic word from God saying do this or do that. It's very distinctive in that regard.
So if I may play a little, not devil's advocate, but push back a little bit, John, are you suggesting then that there are things in Esther that we would make a value judgment and say that you probably should not do that? Like, Esther should not have married a pagan king. Esther should have revealed her identity sooner, like lived out. They should not have taken revenge on this group of people. Are you suggesting that or not?
Yeah, I would say that Esther doesn't become the trump card that overrules Torah. For the Jewish people, the criteria by which they lived is Torah. That's it.
Right.
And the normative guide of how to live as God's set apart people in the world is Torah. It's not Esther. Esther is the story of a remarkable deliverance that was commemorated in a festival. And exceptional things are happening here. And we have to be careful not to take exceptional things that happen and turn them into, well, I don't like the way Torah says it. I don't like the way Torah frames violence and self-defense and vengeance. I don't necessarily like the way Jesus talks about enemy love and stuff like this. And so but I still care a lot about the Bible. So I gain my justification for exacting vengeance when I feel threatened from Esther, right? So if Esther is a trump card against books that are at the center of salvation history and the center of normative ethics, the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Torah, like that's the center from which everything else is the periphery. That comes first. And then you wrestle with Esther, right, as a borderline case.
Right.
And I think the Jews, that's exactly, I think, what the Jews did. I think they recognized that, I think there's a reason they struggled with the book of Esther. There's so many things that just don't match up with Torah. And I think there are deliberate things in here that are meant to bring it within the circle of Torah. And so I think, like the things you mentioned before, and we talk about when we review One Night with the King, specifically mentioning that, Saul was a descendant of, Mordecai was a descendant of Saul, and Haman was a descendant of basically the Amalekites way back. And there was this command of the Lord to Saul to wipe out the Amalekites, and Saul was disobedient, and so the Amalekites continued. That this was like an event that goes way back to the beginning. It was God's will that these people be wiped out. And here we are in the time of Esther, where these people who were not wiped out because of Saul are about to wipe the Jews out.
Yeah.
Right.
I think they're contextualizing the story in the conquest. And to me, the clincher on the fact that the author, not just us trying to, paint this or whitewash it and make the less comfortable parts go away, the author, I think, is wanting to frame this as a conquest-like event because of what he does in chapter 9. So in verse 10, it says, and this is when they go out and they enact vengeance on those who try to kill them. It specifically says in 9:10, the enemy of the Jews, they're talking about the sons of Haman, like the wrath upon the vengeance upon the sons of Haman. It says, but they did not touch the plunder.
Right.
And then again in verse 15, in case you missed it the first time, the Jews that were in Susa gathered on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 Persians in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder.
And again in verse 16.
Yeah, like numerous times, they didn't touch the plunder. That's a direct reference back to the way things were supposed to be in the conquest.
Right.
Like that first battle of Jericho, they were not supposed to touch the plunder, and Achan took some of the plunder under his tent, and that's why God brought wrath upon them, and they lost in their battle to Ai. The not touching plunder was a staple of Yahweh war. When God does the fighting for you, and you're just cleaning up after God winning the battle for you, you do not get wealthy off the war. You do not increase your gold and silver and horses and chariot. You certainly don't touch their idolatry stuff, right? Your way of saying this belongs to God and not me is you don't take the plunder, which is not how kingship like the nations did battles.
Right.
Like they always took the plunder, advanced their kingdom, advanced their weaponry. Esther is saying, we recognize that this battle is not normal Jewish battle.
Yeah.
This is akin to conquest, holy war. God is the victory. We don't profit off of it. And so they're trying to, I think, subsume the war for the vengeance that did happen and make it like this is finishing off the conquest battle against the Amalekites. It's not a new posture for Jews in the exile. We can forget about Torah and our mission in the world. This is like the remnant of an ancient rivalry that was never settled. And it's a way of saying this is kind of a one-off thing more than a regular thing that we should expect going forward.
Yeah, it brings to close the Saul and Agag story that was unresolved, right? In the same way that Saul took plunder and allowed a man to survive, now that's all ended, right?
Yeah.
The Agagites are done. There's no plunder taken, and so how Saul failed, this group of Jews succeeded, and so it brings closure to the whole story, and as you said, doesn't set a an example to follow in the sense of just like attacking people and seeking revenge, unless God calls them to do it.
Yeah, so I'm in saying that Esther is a book on the periphery and not the center. That's not therefore we can dismiss Esther.
Right.
It's just part of a contextual reading, right? It's painting the broader picture, but still Esther is, I think, at the end of the day, included in Torah because it is at the end of the day submitting to God's vision for His people and the limitations He places on war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the problem with Esther is it's subtle. And it requires a lot of understanding that you're bringing to it. And so when you bring that to it, like you just explained about how that works, it reminds us of the conquest, reminds us of what was supposed to happen under Saul, right? If you have none of that, it's just a bunch of people taking revenge for people who are mean to them, right? And that's not at all what's going on.
Yeah. And the very fact that when this book is translated into Greek, you have these additions that you're referring to before, that if you have a copy of the Apocrypha, right, the version of Esther is longer, and it's going to have explicit where God is subtly in the book of Esther, as we have it in most English Bibles, He is overtly there. These dreams from God frame the whole book, and this is a God thing. Which shows the trajectory that at least the Jewish people interpreted Esther in leading up to the time of Jesus. They didn't go the other way. Look, this is a justification of warfare like the nations.
Right.
They actually, the Apocrypha is our first commentary on the book of Esther from a Jewish perspective, and it goes the total opposite way, more deeply into the holy war model, the Yahweh war model, I should say.
Yeah, it's almost like the Spark Notes, Cliff Notes version, right? Like if you missed it the first time, this is how you're supposed to understand it.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Well, we got to the Old Testament.
Yeah. We'll move on from there. And New Testament's right. Or, my
God. New Testament is right?
I don't know what. New Testament's next is what I meant to say.
Right around the corner.
Right around the something like that.
Sure.
That's a great way to end this whole podcast today.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the After Class Podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Right. Get out of here.